Islands. Mary Granger, the supervisor of the Federal Writers Project Savannah Unit, left coastal Georgia's mainland during the fall of 1937 and headed to one of the region's barrier islands in search of evidence that proved shreds of African culture had survived slavery and lived on in Black communities. Sapelo Island was her destination. Granger had visited other Black communities on the mainland, but Sapelo was different. After spending 3 days on the island interviewing ex slaves and their descendants who called the island home, she penned a dramatic description of scenes from her departure. Quote, the boat neared the mainland. Our trip was over. As we bade goodbye to our guide, we cast a look of farewell at the dim outline of the tropical island. On the journey homeward, impressions received during our stay on Sapelo crowded against one another in disturbing sequence. Innumerable memories assailed us. Faintly, the echo of shouting rose and fell in the distance. The measured chanting of voices and the pounding of feet seemed to follow us across the water. Close quote. Granger, an amateur white folklorist and writer, had come to believe, like some anthropologists had during the 1920s and 30s, that the possibility of finding African survivals implanted in Black American communities was strongest on islands. More specifically, islands scattered along the coast of South Carolina and Georgia. Isles bordered by ocean waters, sounds, and inlets, and estuaries that separate them from the mainland. Of course, white anthropologist Melvin Herskovitz, who championed African survival theories, suggested more research should be conducted among, quote, isolated groups living in the savannas of southern Georgia or the Gullah Islands, the Carolina coast, close quote. But even Robert Park, a famous white sociologist who broadly rejected African survival's theories, made an exception for one population, Black Southerners who lived on islands. In an article on race published in 1919, Park wrote, quote, there's every reason to believe that the Negro, when he landed in the United States, left behind him almost everything but his dark complexion and his tropical temperament, close quote. But he conceded some African religious forms survived, quote, on the sea islands, where the slaves were and still are more completely isolated than elsewhere in the South, close quote. A convergence of intellectual and cultural phenomenon had inspired scholars like Melvin Herskovitz and researchers like Mary Granger to hunt African survivals during the 1920s and 30s. The advent of the social sciences and new theories about race, the Black intelligentsia's obsession with their folk roots during the Harlem Renaissance, the Great Migration, which inspired a fascination with Black Southerners, and even U.S. imperial projects on islands inhabited by Black and Brown people all factored in this push. But for Black people living in the Carolina and Low Country and coastal Georgia, these currents would literally pull researchers and writers to the shores of the islands where Black people who would be called Gullah and Geechee lived, communities like the one found on Sapelo. And the island itself was the main character in the works that featured Sapelo Islanders as research subjects. It was portrayed as a sort of incubator, a setting that made quaint and curious cultural retentions possible. The very word island, so frequently associated with remoteness, isolation, and being detached from society, civilization, and modernity, is located is located and loaded with assumptions that researchers use to explain why and how Sapelo Islanders and other Gullah Islanders had retained vestiges of their African ancestors' languages, traces of their folk traditions and beliefs, and why they continued to weave baskets and fishing nets like their forebearers and cook their foods and make their music. The belief that the island itself had minimized cultural fusion and dilution and slowed islanders' arrival in modernity was a racial fantasy nurtured by researchers who were simultaneously preoccupied with African cultural retentions and embraced the idea that Black people's African ancestry was the assumed root of their supposed inferiority. But as anthropologist J. Lauren McTorrey reminds us in his 2008 article on the Gullah-Geechee, an article aptly titled The Illusion of Isolation, the idea that islanders were located in an isolated place is a myth. To start, all the survivals linked to their mythical isolation by 1920s and 1930s researchers could also be found in mainland Black communities in the region. Furthermore, Sapelo Islanders had been going back and forth to the mainland since the earliest days on the island and beyond, escaping slavery and in freedom selling crops and goods and buying goods at the market. And in later decades, migrating and returning home and pursuing education, they all demanded journeys to and from the mainland. In short, they were never isolated. But the intellectual debris of published works like Mary Granger's book Drums and Shadows, which featured Sapelo Islanders and other Gullah-Geechee folk, left an indelible mark on the American racial imagination. Impressions so strong that they helped to shape the stories a new generation of writers would tell in the wake of the Black Power and Black Studies movement. Black women writers remade the African survivals concept in their fictional works, rescuing it from the clutches of primitivists and elevating it to venerable ranks. While most 1920s and 1930s Gullah researchers perceived African survivals as relics of an unusable African past, Black women writers imagined these survivals as literal survival of the Black self and African traditions despite chattel slavery. And Gullah-Geechee islands were transformed in their works too. These women retained the notion that islands and isolation were synonymous concepts, but they reimagined the waters that surrounded these magical places and separated them from mainland communities as buffers against Jim Crow and white supremacy. Paule Marshall's novel Pray Song for the Widow, Gloria Naylor's novel Mama Day, and Julie Dash's film Daughters of the Dust are the most powerful example of Black women's reimagining of Gullah folk and their islands. Marshall imagined Tatum Island. Naylor created the island of Willow Springs, and Dash set her history-making film on, quote, the Sea Islands of the South, close quote. These writers plucked elements and details from Mary Granger's book, Drums and Shadows, to remake Gullah-Geechee folk and remake their islands, homes, as places where coastal Georgia and South Carolina Blacks moved through an alternative power hierarchy in which they possessed the ability to command the forces of nature, talk to their dead, and dictate the terms of their earthly experience. But for Sapelo Islanders and other Gullah-Geechee communities, the fight for survival is interwoven with their efforts to reclaim and redefine the significance of African survivals in their communities. And fantasies about tropical islands and the leisure culture obsession with beach getaways are partly to blame. Black land loss amid, um, tax hikes and development schemes are among other economic threats, making island living on family homesteads less viable for African Americans from these historic communities. And those who know the islanders' contemporary plight, they must imagine the island in a new way. They have to imagine it as a site of contestation in the ongoing struggle for Black freedom. Thank you.